Muted.
Service, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about essential fish habitat and also species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. And the title is what is EFH and ESA and why should FDOT and Federal Highways care? I didn't make that title up. I sort of cannibalized this from another presentation, so I'm not saying that you guys don't care. I know that you do. So, National Marine Fisheries Service, this is sort of our mission. We're responsible for the stewardship of the nation's ocean resources and also estuaries and their habitats. We're responsible for doing things like setting the regulations for fisheries, both commercial and recreational fisheries in federal waters. We have people that inspect seafood that's up for sale, make sure it's safe. We have the people in our Protected Resources Division that are responsible for conserving species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act with the idea that they will actually be able to recover and be taken off of the list at some point. And Habitat Conservation Division is responsible for trying to maintain healthy ecosystems and keep habitats intact so that they can produce fish for sale and also for people that want to go out and catch them recreationally. Okay, so this is just sort of the hierarchy of where we are in the federal government. We're actually part of the Department of Commerce, and that's partly because we regulate fisheries that have some economic value, either as commercial fisheries for sale as food to the public or for people who want to go out and try to catch them recreationally. Within the Department of Commerce, we're part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA. We are the National Marine Fisheries Service, and within NMFS we have the headquarters is located up in Silver Springs, Maryland. We have several different regional offices across the country, and we also have science centers that do research to try and inform the decisions that we make about fisheries and habitat. Within our regional office, the sort of main divisions are sustainable fisheries, and they deal with regulating fisheries and setting catch limits and things like that. Protected Resources deals with endangered species, and Habitat Conservation deals with essential fish habitat. You see on sort of the little sidebar on the right bottom, the agency was actually formed about 1871 as the U.S. Fish Commission, and it's gone through several different changes as far as what the name was and where it's at within the government. But in 1970, we became actually NMFS and as part of NOAA. This just shows the different regions we have. We have the West Coast region, Alaska region, Pacific Islands, which is out by Hawaii and Guam and places like that, the Greater Atlantic region, and we're within the Southeast region and Caribbean region, also known as CIRO. And so all those little stars that you see in the Southeast region are all the Habitat Conservation Division field offices, and the two stars off to the right there are actually our Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands field offices. So FDOT deals primarily with either the Habitat Conservation Division for essential fish habitat consultations or the Protected Resources Division that deals with Endangered Species Act consultations. And in Habitat Conservation, the idea is that we provide recommendations on projects to try to do three different things, and there's a hierarchy. The first thing is that if there's any impacts, we want to see if there's a way to avoid them. That's really the first line of defense. If you don't break it, you don't have to fix it. So if you avoid impacts, it's not a problem for us, and it's not a problem for FDOT either. Sometimes there's impacts you just can't avoid. So in that case, try to minimize those impacts to the extent that you can, and whatever is left after you minimize, then you have to go in and deal with compensatory mitigation to offset those impacts. And in habitat conservation for essential fish habitat, the statutory entity that we operate under is the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. The other division you deal with, and this is for endangered species, would be the Protected Resources Division. And the idea is that we're going to conserve species that are listed in the Endangered Species Act as either threatened or endangered species, with the idea that I said, once again, we're trying to conserve them so that they can actually increase their numbers, recover, and they can be taken off of that list. And then you won't have to do any ESA consultations on those species. In Florida, you'd be dealing with the Gulf sturgeon, Johnson seagrass, the different sea turtle species, staghorn and elkhorn corals. North Atlantic right whales, FDOT probably doesn't really have to do a whole lot with those, but I suppose potentially you could if you had to dispose of material offshore. Short-nosed sturgeon and small-toothed sawfish. So I'm going to kind of talk about the Habitat Conservation Division and essential fish habitat first. Our job is basically to provide recommendations to state and federal agencies to try to have the best outcome possible for projects that may impact coastal resources. And so, like I said, our main statutory entity that we deal with is the Magnuson-Stevens Act, but we also have authorities under the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, the Clean Water Act, Rivers and Harbor Act, the Federal Power Act, and the Deepwater Port Act. And so I think everybody knows in estuaries there's a lot of fish in the estuaries, and there's a lot of different habitats in those estuaries that act as nurseries that help support fisheries by allowing young fish to grow big enough so that they become big fish and they can reproduce and produce more fish. In Florida we have salt marshes, mangroves, seagrasses, also oyster reefs, and if you're in southeast Florida, you have coral reefs to deal with. So why is this fish habitat important, and why should it be protected? Well, the majority of fish species in Florida, at least in some part of their life cycle, are dependent on estuarine habitats. Those habitats also prevent erosion from occurring, which helps water quality, of course. If there's a flood situation, a lot of those habitats can sort of absorb that flood water before it gets up to the uplands where people are. And it's also something that's important to people in terms of aesthetic and recreational values, especially if you go out fishing, you go to the beach, you spend time on the water. The other thing about fish habitat is, like I said, if you don't break it, you don't have to fix it. But if you have to fix it and restore habitat or enhance it or try to create it, it's not cheap, and you folks all know that. So this is from the Magnuson-Stevens Act. One of the greatest long-term threats to the viability of commercial and recreational fisheries is the continuing loss of marine estuarine and other aquatic habitats. So, you know, everybody knows that you have to have some place to live, and fish are no different. If you look at the TV news and a tornado goes through someplace in the Midwest and those towns get shredded and their houses are gone and there's no more supermarket, they're in a bad situation. Well, if you destroy fish habitat, those fish are in the same kind of a bad situation. They don't have any place to live in. They don't have any place that they can necessarily get food easily. So what is essential fish habitat? Well, it's defined in the Magnuson-Stevens Act as those waters and substrates necessary to fish for spawning, breeding, feeding, and growth to maturity. So again, that's the same idea that a fish has to be able to grow to a size of maturity where it can, of course, produce more fish. And so part of our agency's mission, and part of the reason that we're under Department of Commerce, is that that fish resource has a value, has an economic value, both to the commercial fisheries who sell it for food and also an economic value to recreational fisheries, where a lot of people spend a lot of money sometimes buying boats and fishing gear and hiring guides and all kinds of things that are part of the economy. So one thing about EFH is essential fish habitat is only really designated for the fish species that have a federal fishery management plan. So there's certain management plans depending on whether you're on the East Coast for the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council or you're in the Gulf side with the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council. And they have certain federal fishery management plans, and the fish in those plans have EFH designated for them. And the documents that describe the EFH for those fish species describe the fisheries and their habitat, something called habitat areas of particular concern, which are particularly important habitat areas. What are the threats to essential fish habitat, and how can those habitats be conserved? So I'm going to use the Gulf of Mexico as the example here, although there's a parallel sort of universe for the Atlantic side, the South Atlantic. But as an example, the Gulf of Mexico EFH is based on 6 different fishery management plans that are comprised totally of 41 species. Red drum has its own fishery management plan. There's 4 species in the shrimp plan, 32 species in the reef fish plan, 3 in coastal migratory pelagics, and 1 in spiny lobster, and then the coral is sort of a little more amorphous because it sort of just covers them all. So as an example, red drum EFH. So if you go to the EFH document, there is a textual description of what constitutes EFH for the Gulf of Mexico, for example, which you see here. And then there's also a map that's basically generated from that description. And as you can see for red drum, basically all the estuaries in the Gulf of Mexico are EFH for red drum because that's at least part of their life cycle is spent there. Okay, so when you look at sort of all of the EFH amendments taken together, there's certain things in the estuaries that always pop out as being essential fish habitat, and those include emergent wetlands or salt marshes, mangroves, submerged aquatic vegetation or seagrass, algal flats, mud, sand, shell, and rock substrates, and estuary water column. Now, mostly we focus on certain of those habitats. We don't usually get too worked up about mud, sand, shell, and rock substrates because they're fairly plentiful. And water column we sometimes deal with in terms of water quality issues. But salt marshes, mangroves, submerged aquatic vegetation, those are very important ones. If you're on the Atlantic side, of course, you have corals also, which are a high priority habitat for us. On the marine side, FDOT doesn't have to deal with this too much, except maybe down in the Keys, because most of the things are more coastal estuarine rather than being out in the sort of offshore waters. But in marine EFH, you have water column, vegetated bottoms, non-vegetated bottoms, live bottom, which is sort of hard bottom, coral reefs, geologic features, and continental shelf features. The Atlantic has sort of a similar set of things, although the descriptive term they use may be slightly different, but it's basically the same habitat. Now, FDOT doesn't have to worry in the Gulf, at least, about habitat areas of particular concern because most of these are hard bottom and coral reef areas that are offshore where you're not going to have any FDOT projects. But this is what they are. They're mostly coral reef and hard bottom stuff. Okay, so each federal agency shall consult with the Secretary, and they're talking about Secretary of Commerce there, with respect to any action that may adversely affect any essential fish habitat identified under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. So the bottom line here is, if you're not going to have an adverse effect on EFH, you don't have to do a consultation. And so in ETDM, if I get a project that's in Immokalee, there's obviously no fish habitat, no marine estuarine fish habitat there. And I'd say, well, we have no involvement with this, and there's no need to do any kind of essential fish habitat assessment or anything like that. So we look at these projects and we decide, is there going to be an adverse effect, and that's what we base the decision about whether an EFH assessment is necessary or not. And so this is sort of the way the process works. You know, a federal agency, which we call the action agency, comes to us and says that they want to do an EFH consultation, and that would usually be either Federal Highways or FDOT as the Federal Highways representative, or the Corps or the Coast Guard. And depending on the document, we have different time periods that we're supposed to respond to that request in. So we look at it. If we decide that there is an adverse effect to EFH, we can provide conservation recommendations. In terms of FDOT, we don't very often do conservation recommendations because we look at stuff so early in the ETDM process that we usually have all those details and all the mitigation and everything worked out ahead of time, so there's no need for us to provide conservation recommendations. So we don't do that very often. If we do, however, provide conservation recommendations, there's two things that can happen. Sort of the agency and the applicant can say, yes, we'll do those conservation recommendations, and they move forward. Or if they decide that they can't do it for some reason or don't want to do it, they do have to write to us and explain to us why they can't do it. And at that point, you know, it could get elevated. Different things could happen. But like I said, we don't have to provide conservation recommendations very often, so we don't get into that situation very much. Okay, so if we do ask for an EFH assessment, there are certain things that are supposed to be in the assessment. The first thing is that you have to describe the project in enough detail that we'll know exactly what's going to be done. You have to look at any adverse effects that might occur to EFH and the managed species that are sort of designated as part of the EFH situation, and then say, okay, well, here's what the adverse effects are. This is what we think about those effects. Are they good, or you know, are they bad? Are they really bad? You know, are they very minimal? And then you have to describe, okay, there's going to be adverse effects. What kind of mitigation are you going to do? What kind of compensation are you going to provide in terms of mitigation to offset the impacts to that habitat and the functions that it provides? So an EFH assessment, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's really based on how large and how complex the project is and how severe the adverse impact might be. So if you're looking at a large bridge, it's a complicated project, there's a lot of impacts, there's a lot of different things going on, it's going to be a fairly large and detailed document with, you know, a fair amount of analysis in it. If you're just doing some little podunk culvert replacement, the EFH assessment doesn't have to be that big. If the impacts are very small, the EFH assessment is not very big also. So you just have to look at it in the context of what the project is, how big it is, and how complex it is as to how big a document you need to produce. Okay, so this is just sort of a sidebar in terms of EFH in terms of seagrass surveys and when we would like those surveys done. So we prefer it be done from June 1st through September 30th. Some of the other agencies, the state agencies, have slightly different windows. Some of them will let you start a little earlier, like maybe May, and they might even let you go into October. This is the window we prefer because this is the prime growing season. So if you go look at an area, if there's no seagrass there, there's probably not any seagrass there because it would show up at this time of year. So this is a good time frame to really show us that there is or there isn't seagrass there. And it also eliminates the need to do multiple surveys. You can go out and do a survey in December, but then when you're getting ready to do the project, we're going to look at that and go, no, you got to go back in June and look at this before you proceed because that survey in December is not necessarily reliable. Okay, now I'm going to start getting into the ESA end of things. So we'll talk a little bit about Essential Fish Habitat consultation versus Endangered Species Act consultation. So one thing is that you could have a couple of species in Florida that you would have to do both consultations for. So it can be essential fish habitat, but it can also be a listed species under the Endangered Species Act. Most of the species that's not true for, but it is true for Johnson seagrass and also for the staghorn, elkhorn, coral species. With both types of consultations, though, the main thing is that we really would want you to avoid the impacts in the first place. Then you don't have to deal with all the rest of it. If you can't avoid the impacts, certainly want you to minimize it to the extent that it's feasible to do that. One difference between EFH consultations and ESA is that while for an EFH consultation, if you do compensatory mitigation, we take that into account in the consultation. So if you're going to impact something, but you do adequate compensatory mitigation, we sort of call it a wash and say, okay, you're good. The way the ESA, Endangered Species Act, is written and our interpretation by our attorneys is that we're not really allowed to take compensatory mitigation into account when we do ESA consultations. Now they're working on a sort of a mitigation policy document, and that may or may not change. I can't say that I know anything one way or the other on that, but for the moment, when we do the analysis, we don't take compensatory mitigation into account. In general, when you go to NMFS for ESA and EFH consultations, you're going to have two different biologists because there's two different divisions and they're sort of formed under two different statutory entities. However, with FDOT, because of the way the funding agreement is written with NMFS, you only deal with one biologist. So if you come to Brandon for consultations for ESA and EFH, he's going to do them both in the same thing. If you're on the Gulf side, if you come to me, I do both the Endangered Species Act consultation and the Essential Fish Habitat consultation. Okay, so under Endangered Species Act, you're generally going to be doing a consultation under Section 7 of the Act. There are some other different sections of the Act that deal with other aspects of endangered species. Like if you're going to do research on something and you have to get a permit to do the research, so that's a different section of the Act. But FDOT's going to be doing Section 7 consultations with us. So there's something called the Affirmative Conservation Mandate that says that federal agencies shall use their authorities to carry out their programs for the conservation of endangered and threatened species. And then there's also the duty to avoid jeopardy. So each federal agency shall consultation with the Secretary of Commerce ensure that any action authorized, funded, or carried out by such agency, which is the agency, in this case is the action agency who comes for the consultation, that it's not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species, and also if it's designated critical habitat for that species, that it's not going to destroy or adversely modify that habitat. So a federal actions agency comes to us initially, and that could be federal highways, it could be FDOT, and of course FDOT is trying to get the NEPA assignment, so if you get the NEPA assignment, you are essentially going to be acting as a federal action agency in that case. So it could be federal highways, could be FDOT, could be the Corps, could be the Coast Guard that comes to us and they ask for a Section 7 consultation. So they have to provide us with effects determinations for any species, any listed species that they think are maybe going to be affected by the action, or if the designated critical habitat is going to be affected by the action. And they have to give effects determinations that tell us what kind of effects they think that there's going to be on those species. They also have to provide us with the relevant project information so that we can do an analysis of the effects and then write our response document. And so that's sort of a sticking point sometimes, because sometimes folks want to get consultations done early, but there's not really enough known about the project sometimes that we can really do an analysis, and the analysis that we need to do. You know, I run into that a lot with pile driving, where they haven't really been designed yet, and they don't really know all the particulars about that end of it, and it's hard to really do an analysis and do a response document in that case. But we do the best we can. So the effects determinations, there's basically three different things that you can determine. Say no effect. If there's no effect on the species or the habitat, then really there's no consultation, because if you say no effect, there's nothing for us to consult on. So if you say no effect, and assuming that we agree with that determination, we're all right with it, we basically say nothing. A lot of times we're asked for concurrence, but our attorneys have told us that we don't concur on no effect determinations. So when we don't respond to it, we don't give you a concurrence, we're sort of implicitly concurring, although you didn't hear that from me. But, basically that's the end of the consultation. There is no consultation, so the whole thing's a done deal at that point. The other determination could be a may affect but not likely to adversely affect determination, and that would lead to an informal consultation where we would look at the project, and if we decide that we agree with that determination, and we send an informal consultation letter of concurrence, and that's the end of the consultation. The third one, as you could say, may affect, and it is likely to adversely affect. In that case, we do a formal consultation where we have to produce a biological opinion that decides whether there's going to be jeopardy to the existence of the species or destruction or adverse modification of designated critical habitat, and then we proceed from there. So here's the process. The federal agency or action agency that asks for the consultation, we are supposed to look at the consultation and respond in 30 days and decide whether there's enough information to proceed with the consultation or whether we need more information. If we need more information, we'll come back to you and say, you know, this is what we need to proceed with the consultation. Once we get that information, statutorily, we are supposed to complete an informal consultation in 30 days, and the formal consultations are supposed to be completed within 135 days. So that's the 90 days in that one box plus the 45 days to actually produce the biological opinion. So it's a total of 135 days. I realize that we have not been doing a very good job of this lately. We've been backlogged. We are trying to work on moving things quicker through the process, and I'll talk about a couple of programs that we have that are supposed to assist with that. If we are doing a formal, though, and we produce a biological opinion, that opinion is going to either say there's no jeopardy to the species involved, there's no destruction or adverse mod to critical habitat, or there may be jeopardy to the species or destruction or adverse modification. That doesn't happen very often, but in that case, you have to go through, you know, if you want to sort of fight that, you have to go through another whole process where it gets elevated. But that does not happen very often. Okay, so like I said, we're trying to start some new programs to try to speed things up because it has been taking a long time to get some of these consultations through our review process and signed off. And I know that delays things, and we're certainly not trying to delay any projects. It's just we just got hit with a tidal wave of consultations a few years back, and we're still playing catch up. So one program is a waiver program. So if you come to us and want to do a consultation, and we have already done a consultation on a similar project, say it's a bridge project, and there's this bridge project you want to do is pretty identical to one that you've done previously that was consulted on and reviewed by our general counsel. We have an expedited review process where it goes through much less review because it's the same kind of project and it's already been looked at, and we know what conclusions we came to. So that's one thing to expedite the process. We also are developing some programmatics where you look at sort of a suite of activities overall over a certain span of time. And so if an activity is covered under programmatic, something like the statewide programmatic that we completed with the Corps recently, you know, they're covered under that, and because it's under the programmatic, you're good to go. We also have something called a pilot program, which is the newest thing. And the idea here is that the action agency comes to us with something more than what they typically give us, which is just really usually a description of the project, where they describe the project to us, but then we have to go do the analysis and, you know, write a document that includes the analysis. But if they come to us with a more thorough amount of information, including an analysis, so you get a project description, but you also get an analysis of the effects, we look at that, and if we're satisfied with the description and the analysis that's done for the effects, then we just say, yeah, we concur. We write you a one-page document, and that happens very quick. That's something that I know we're working on with the Corps, but we could be doing it with other agencies as well. And so that's all I have on EFH and ESA, and I'll take any questions. I think Brandon is on the phone also if there's something that's very specific to the East Coast. So I'll take any questions.
All right, so for those folks, thank you very much, Dave. But so for those folks on the phone that have questions, if you can raise your hand, and then we'll unmute you one at a time. It looks like we have one question from Ann. Go ahead, Ann.
You can see at the bottom of the list on the left. Yellow blinking on the left.
Oh.
I think District 4 put the question in the chat box for us, and the question is, for the waiver program, what specific information is needed regarding the previously cleared project? Do we provide permit information? What information can we provide to get that consultation?
Well, I mean, you can always communicate with us if you have if you're doing a specific project and you say, this is basically the same thing as this other project that was already consulted on. You can let us know that. I mean, a lot of times I might get a project and I'm going to, just I do all the FF stuff on the Gulf Coast as far as ESA goes. I may know myself without being told, but I mean, certainly if you have something in mind that was a similar project and say, this is very similar to that, you think this will work under a waiver, you can call me or send me an email, same thing with Brandon, and suggest that to us.
Thanks for that. And the next question was from District 2. Do you have any information about the Atlantic sturgeon?
Okay, is Brandon on the line?
Yeah, we'll have to unmute him really quick. Okay, Brandon, go ahead.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes, barely though. Just a little bit.
Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Atlantic sturgeon, as far as I know, there's only breeding populations of Atlantic sturgeon down to the St. Johns River. So if you do have project impacts within the St. Johns River, then you should mention them in your consultation initiation package, such as your ESBA and your Section 7 checklist. So, and they're affected by things. I mean, for a DOT project, it's hard to imagine that we could rise to the level of may affect requiring a biological opinion. There may be situations where you have may affect not likely to adversely affect, where there's in-water work and there could be interactions with construction equipment or turbidity or things like that. But we've dealt with that before on certain projects up there. But that's about it. So if you're south of the St. Johns River, I wouldn't include them in my ESBA.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. Question is also from District 4. Can you tell us what the Corps, I'm not sure if I can really ask this question, I'm not sure if this is going to be for you to answer, but the question is, what will the Corps require to demonstrate coordination? So both David and Brandon, when the Corps is the lead agency, what have they been providing to you for consultation and coordination purposes? And hopefully, what are some of the things that we can provide to help with that?
Regarding the waiver program. I think, yeah.
Well, can you guys still hear me? If you can, I would say just so there's not a mistake and understanding here, just because there's a waiver form in place, it waives general counsel review. It doesn't waive the need to consult. So you're still going to have to go through consultation, and there's still going to be, it may be a shorter turnaround because there's been a similar project that evaluated similar species, or the same species rather, but you still have to go through consultation. And there's a form that we fill out that goes along with the draft biological opinion when we provide it. And sometimes it's approved, the waiver is approved, and sometimes it's not. So it can, I would just say that in my experience, when there's a GC waive or it's been waived, that I still had to provide the same level of details that are in every other project. And we have example projects for each species that's been evaluated. So what I'm trying to say is there's not a whole lot going to be required in addition to what DOT typically requires. That evaluation should be almost transparent to you guys, and we do that on our side more than on your side.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Brandon. So with the waiver program, we still write a letter of concurrence, and it does get some review. It's just not as extensive as a typical thing that goes through the whole process, but we still have to write a letter of concurrence. So, you know, with a pilot program, that's much quicker because it's sort of a form letter saying, yes, we agree with you, and you're done. We don't have to go write a letter of concurrence for something like that. But with the waiver program, we still have to write that letter of concurrence.
Thank you for that clarification. Does anyone else have any questions? I'm kind of going through to see if anyone is raising their hand.
This is Katasha. Dave, I have a question. Do you guys have any other programmatic agreements that you're working on right now?
Well, I'm sure there's some in the works. I'm not really. We have specific people over protected resources that deal with the programmatics. I know that I think they're in the middle of sort of updating that statewide programmatic that they did to include some extra activities, but I'm not sure exactly where that is in the process. But this seems to be a new sort of direction that they're taking for not just for transportation projects, but for a lot of different activities where they're trying to deal with it with programmatics, just because it's it just cuts down on the number of individual consultations we end up having to do. And so it's just another thing that they're trying to do to hopefully eliminate this backlog that's been causing the delays. So I can try to find out what other things they're working on in terms of programmatics, but I don't know specifically what the other ones are right now.
Do you know approximately how long an agreement like that would take to put together? A couple years, or do you think it would be a little bit faster?
Yeah, I'd say probably a couple of years. I haven't done one myself, so I don't want to give out bad information. But it takes a little while because you have to compile a lot of information and look at sort of usually they look at things over maybe a 5-year period in terms of how many activities they're expecting of that particular type. So it takes a little while, and of course that's got to go through. If it's programmatic, it probably gets scrutinized considerably more than just a regular individual consultation. So it takes a while, probably a couple of years. I'd just be about right. Like with a lot of things, it depends on how many resources you want to throw at it as to how long it takes.
Sure.
Is there any more questions? I'm looking on the chat box. I don't see anything. Anybody's hand.
Where's the question?
Okay. All right. Well, I definitely appreciate you being able to come over to Tampa, Dave, and take your time to give us this presentation. And I thank Brandon for being willing to call in and be available to us and help us out with this. We really appreciate the presentation. We got a couple of really nice comments in the chat box as well about the presentation. So thank you guys very much, and hope everyone has a great day.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.